Welcome back to the show, folks. My name is Emal Barielli, and my guest today is going to be joining us shortly to talk to us about some of the foundational concepts and activities that are involved in um, creating and managing a requirements program for the projects that business analysts work on. And we are live, so please make sure that you're putting your comments and your questions into the chat, and we're going to get an opportunity near the end of the session to go through and answer some of your comments and questions. Now, some of the feedback that I've received from other live sessions is that I haven't really done a good job of introducing myself, because I tend to just come on here and start talking, assuming that you folks do know who I am, and I should not be making that assumption. So let me introduce myself. My name is Emal Barielli. I have been a business analyst since 2005, and before that, I spent my entire educational life learning about software development, solution delivery, business, and systems analysis. So I just flashed that up there to give you a quick idea of who I am. But more importantly, I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about who our guest is, because our guest today is Karl Wiegers, who I'm sure I don't have to introduce, but I'll give you a brief introduction. Karl he's a prolific author, and his latest book is titled Software Requirements Essentials. You see the URL there where you can find more details about that. But Karl has been developing software, I would say, longer than I've probably been alive. And he has amassed, I'm going to say, a wealth of knowledge over the course of his career around how software gets built. But much of the authorship that he's done has been around requirements management and how to write really good requirements. And so in today's session, I'm going to be speaking with Karl a little bit about his thoughts on some of the subjects that he has written about in that book. And so, again, I'll remind you that we are live. I'm going to ask you to, feel free to say hello. We have a couple of folks coming in here. Robert Hamilton is coming in from Birmingham, UK. Let us know where you're coming in from. And also put your comments and questions directly into the chat there. Part of the reason why I wanted to have Karl on is because his thoughts on requirements, specifications, and this entire area, which is essentially the core of what business analysts do, I think comes closest to matching the reality that I've seen on the ground in my own career. And he's been publishing for a very, very long time, and software development, quite frankly, hasn't really changed that much in the last 20 years. Sure, there's a lot of technology, but a lot of the requirements management practices that Karl discusses are still the same, right? Some of the names may have changed, but a lot of the really core principles around how you should conduct a requirements analysis program are the same. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to have Karl on to speak to us about this subject. Without further ado, I'm going to bring our guest on, Karl. Karl, thank you for taking the time to join us, and welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks very much, Emal. Appreciate the chance to talk with you. Just a few comments here to start. First, I thought the music you had, your opening music, is pretty cool.
Oh, yeah?
So,
all right,
so
great.
Thank you. Enjoyed the music. Second, I neglected to tell you a common piece of information that's often important, which is how to pronounce my name. It's actually Wiegers, not Wiegers, and it's very, very commonly misspelled, very commonly pronounced the other way. So it's Wiegers. But
Wiegers,
yeah,
thank you for correcting that. Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to mention is that you suggested that I may have been doing software longer than you've been alive, and there's a good chance of that because I actually first learned to program in college 53 years ago, which I find really hard to believe, but that's true.
And you'd be surprised at how much of that is still being taught in universities today, because when I did my undergrad, a lot of my courses were in computer science, and many of the professors who were teaching the subjects, many of them didn't even own personal computers, and they were essentially teaching the subjects that were being taught 50 years ago. And I think that really just goes to the point that I made earlier around the fact that software development is software development. The core of it hasn't changed for a long time. So thank you for taking the time to join us. I know that you and Candace have written a new book. I know that the book is much shorter than many of the books. And and if you could actually just show us the title of that as well. Yeah, there we go. The Software Requirements Essentials.
Small book.
Small book. I wanted to have you on to ask you a few questions around why you've written the book in the way that you have. And I'd like to start off the conversation by really kind of showing this image of probably, I would say, is in the table of contents for the folks that are watching here. You started the book with laying the foundation. And I'm wondering if you can give us some insight as to why that's the important place to start.
Sure. That'd be a good place to start our conversation. So I did write this book deliberately to be a small book. Some of you may be familiar with my book, Software Requirements, which third edition was published 10 years ago. And that's a seriously big book. That's about 650 pages long that I co-authored with Joy Beatty. And it's very comprehensive. And I think the content in there is just as valuable and meaningful today as it was back then. Because as you point out, a lot of stuff doesn't change very quickly, particularly around requirements in business analysis, which is not so much a technical problem as a human communication issue.
Right.
But I realize that not everybody, not every BA or product owner or product manager may have the time to read a great big book. And there are a lot of great big books like this out there. So what we did is Candace Hoganson and I decided to write a short book, which is very concentrated. It's only about 160 pages of content, but we're taking a very precise look at what we think are the 20 most important practices around requirements that pretty much apply to every project. I don't know if it struck you that those were kind of universal.
They absolutely did. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to actually put this up and talk about them a little bit more, because I think when you're looking at those 20 practices, I think the 5 main ones that we're looking at here kind of fall under this concept of laying the foundation. I guess my...
well, let me tell you a story about why I think this is really important. Those 5.
Sure.
So there's a great story about why it's important not to just dive into talking to people about what they think of as their requirements, but laying this foundation for a successful project. So many years ago, when I was a software developer in the research labs for a big company, I got a call from my manager one day. He said, "Do you have an hour?" I said, "Sure. What do you need?" Mm-hmm. So he told me that one of the scientists in the research labs had approached him with a small program he had written on his PC for doing some real common routine calculations. Right. And the scientist wanted our software group to put this little program on our mainframe so everybody could use it. Mm-hmm. And it was a small program, so my manager thought it would only take me about an hour. So I could have just done that, right? I could have said, all right, well, let me port that over, and there we are. But it seemed to me that there was potentially a lot more to it than that simple request. And so I thought it would be worth exploring this a little further and try to get the answers to some important questions before we dived in. So here are some questions that I think every business analyst should ask and every project team should be able to answer. Questions like, why are we working on this?
Right.
What are we trying to build? Who are we trying to satisfy? How can we tell if our solution is good enough? How will we know when we're done? And I think those are pretty important questions, again, globally, don't you think?
Absolutely. Not only that, but I think that since the days where software was really built in small components to solve specific problems, one of the big things that have changed in enterprise really is that you now have a lot more bigger pieces of software meant to solve a lot of different challenges all at the same time. So for example, if a company wants to implement a new finance system, finance has a lot of practices and a lot of activities involved across, let's say, a domain like that. The kind of questions that I think you started asking very, very early on about why are we doing this, and probably some of the questions around, wait, how does this fit with the other things that you're doing? Right, I think is an important piece to add to that, because when you enter into enterprise, you're very rarely building something that is living in isolation. And I think your comment just now, I think, speaks to that fact. And if there is anything that's changed, is that software has just gotten bigger and it's becoming used a lot more, which means that it is a lot more interdependent. So, hey, if you're going to implement one piece of functionality, there's a very high likelihood that it's going to be related to something else. When it comes to requirements management, I would imagine that that's something that you're trying to uncover through the practices that you talk about.
Well, yes. But actually, I think what you say is partly true, but I think partly it's not true, because just look at the explosion of small apps
Right.
for every conceivable purpose. And so on the one hand, we do have these big general purpose sorts of applications that cover lots of capabilities for lots of stakeholders and needs. But then we have these very small focus things as well, and everything in between. And I think those questions that I suggested there for this particular, that were triggered by this particular project request, those apply to little things and to big things. But let me tell you what happened when I did this. I spent some time looking into the real problem and the real business objectives for that little 1 hour request. And ultimately that little 1 hour project took 100 hours of my time to properly understand, specify, design, code, and test.
Right.
And it was very, very successful. And so I think that these practices that you were just showing there that are laying the foundation, where the book starts, are very important to make sure that we're understanding where we're going and we can tell how we get there and we know what we're trying to accomplish and why. So those are all the really important starting points. And then we can get serious about understanding exactly what the needs are and exactly what we need to build and exactly how it does fit into the rest of our universe.
Right. And so I guess if I was to look at practice number one, where you say understand the problem before converging on a solution, that's really what you're speaking to here, is that it took you 100 hours to actually understand the problem and build the solution.
Right.
When in the mind of the manager at the time, this probably seemed like a relatively small thing.
Tiny little thing. Just bang it out. You're done.
Okay. And I think,
what would have happened had I done that? We would have been bombarded with this continuous stream of enhancement requests and corrections. Could you add this? And wait, this does part of what I need, but it doesn't do that part of what I need. And wait a minute, this is giving me a little bit different numbers than what I used to get this other way. So which numbers do I believe? So we would have been chasing the problem for ages, as opposed to spending the time to understand the problem, build a solution, and then grow it as necessary, without feeling like you're chasing it and just never quite getting caught up.
Yeah. So the understood. And I think that probably answers the first major question that I had for you, which was, why is it important to really understand the challenge, right? I think your comment about the fact that I think you've already answered that question, because if you don't understand the challenge and you don't fully grasp what the true need is, there's a very high likelihood that you're going to get a barrage of change requests, follow-up questions, possibly some defects that are coming out of the entire software development process that you're going to have to fix anyways.
And what can happen if you're not careful about laying this starting point of understanding the problem is you can build a solution for the wrong problem and experience project success, but product failure. So that's what we want to try to avoid. And sometimes the reason I think that this is important for business analysts to think about is that sometimes the apparent problem that you're presented with isn't the real problem. It might be just a part of the real problem. It might be just a symptom of the real problem. Or on the other hand, you might be given a solution like I was, just go put this on the mainframe. You might be asked to build a particular solution which could perhaps only address part of the problem or a symptom rather than a real problem. So I think it's really important to make sure that we get down to understanding the real target before we start shooting arrows at it.
Yeah. And I think the importance of that can't be understated. And, I smile a lot when you're talking about things, because some of the things you say, I'm constantly thinking back to specific experiences where these things have popped up in my life. And, in my earlier days when I wasn't as wise, I think, as I am now about this process, I made a lot of the mistakes that you're
Sure.
talking about here,
Of course.
where you think to yourself, you walk in, you think you know the answer, and you think, hey, it looks a little bit smaller. And the process essentially just teaches you that, no, there's a lot more involved here, especially when it comes to certain. I remember when I worked on a piece of software that had literally 3 screens, but the complexity of the software and the rules underneath were so
Right.
complicated that on the surface, even to me, it looked like, hey, these are just 3 mock-ups. But a lot of the business rules that had to be baked in to make these screens work the way that the user wanted required months upon months of analysis work to be done. So,
And you're hitting on a really important point there that I think is worth amplifying. Sometimes people build prototypes. Prototyping is a very powerful technique. It's great for exploring requirements, understanding needs, validating requirements, looking at design alternatives, optimizing usability, design, all that kind of stuff. But they do not replace requirements. And so just because someone drew up some screens, no matter how good they look, no matter how sensible they are, that's only the tip of the iceberg that we see. And what you don't see is the detailed specifics behind it. And your example of having lots of complex and interacting business rules is really a good example of that. So I think people have to be very careful to avoid the temptation to just throw together a visual mock-up, a prototype, and say, well, we don't need to write requirements, just look at this and go build that, because the complexity is often being masked. And if you don't get into that, then you're going to have the same problem of chasing the problem and taking you much longer to get to where you want to be than if you actually thought about it a little bit first.
Right. And you know what? I think in this world, I think that that's always been an issue, Karl.
Sure.
Now, unfortunately, this push and this pressure towards trying to go agile, I think, has exacerbated that problem.
It has.
And magnified that problem to a much bigger extent, because a lot of what I tend to see out there in the materials that are being published about requirements and the profession seems to imply to new analysts that they can get away with just writing a user story and producing a mock-up. And, we do these 2 things and we're done. Oftentimes it's management that buys into this idea that you can really avoid having to do the real analysis work because you're agile now. Anything you can share with us about any thoughts that you have on that subject by any chance?
Well, I think your point's exactly correct. And it's very tempting. I mean, who wouldn't like to just throw something together and say, well, here, this is all the thinking we have to do. But really, what you're doing then is you're just deferring the problem. You're going to get the requirements right eventually. It's just a lot more expensive to get it right by getting it wrong repeatedly and then incrementally approaching it. Requirements development is by its very nature an incremental and iterative process. There's just no way around that. But it's a lot more expensive to iterate on code than it is to iterate on concepts and models and descriptions of things. So I think that the notion that we can just write down a few user stories and get a little stack of those and whip out some screens and just go build the product. Yeah, I'm sure there are cases where that works. And then I'm sure there are many other cases where you're missing a lot of stuff that you're going to have to go back and fix it. And one of the words that I hate the most in the English language is rework.
Rework.
I hate rework. I hate doing over something that I've already done once. Again, some of that's intrinsic in what we do. It's the very nature of what we do for lots of reasons. It's to be expected. But when you're doing excessive rework, and you ask yourself, could we have maybe avoided some of this? How could we have avoided that? And a lot of times it's by doing a little better job of requirements elicitation, not overlooking certain stakeholders, modeling before you construct something, that sort of stuff. So I think the time spent on that kind of thinking is a pretty good investment.
I think there's a saying amongst carpenters that goes, measure twice, cut once.
And twice is usually not enough when it comes to software. I used to use that same expression. In fact, in my very first book, which was called Creating a Software Engineering Culture,
right,
I cited that and I said, when it comes to software, it's design 1,000 times, cut once.
That's right. That's
code
right.
ones. So let's iterate on designs. Let's iterate on requirements, and let's not try to do as much iteration on code because that's more expensive. Now, some of it's still valuable. The idea of putting something in front of people so they can give you feedback, that's great, but that's not a substitute for thinking and
That's
talking to
right.
people.
That's right. And I think there is a missing piece here that we can possibly explore in a future live session or a future appearance. But there are a number of different layers that you have to think about when it comes to doing analysis work, right? Doing a mock-up is really just kind of the user interface layer where you're kind of giving your users a sense of what it is that they're going to get. But I think a lot of analysts tend to kind of stop there and not go down to the deeper layers where a lot of the complexity kind of lives, right? Mm-hmm. These deeper layers tend to be mostly focused around the implementation of business rules, but I'm not going to take the conversation in that direction today, but I do want to just put that out there. I think let me just flash this. So in some of what you just said, you touched on a couple of different subjects. We've talked a little bit about the importance of making sure that we understand the problem. Let's talk a little bit more about the practices number 2 and number 3 here, because number 2, you say the best practice is to define the business objectives, and number 3 is to define the solution boundaries. Can you talk to us a little bit about what those actually mean and why they're important?
Yeah, in fact, I want to add something, excuse me, to the point about making sure we understand the problem first, is that if you're presented with a problem, then instead of just accepting that as being correct, do a little root cause analysis to try to understand, okay, if this is our problem, either our business objective or a problem that we want to try to solve, do some root cause analysis, which is a way of thinking backward, asking why several times to get to the point where we feel like we understand the causes that contribute to that problem. And then you've got some actionable root causes to try to make sure that whatever solution you come up with will address. Similarly, right, if you're presented with a solution, here's the question to ask. If that solution is the answer, what was the question? Asking why a few times there can help you be confident that you really do understand the problem and the solution either will or won't address that problem.
Right.
So I wanted to just get that point in too.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I can dive a lot more deeply on that because I have a lot of experiences around the challenges in doing root cause analysis on certain types of issues. And these aren't really analysis challenges. They're more related to stakeholders and their willingness to actually sit down and go through that exercise with you. Or in some instances, there may be some organizational factors that you have to contend with when you're trying to get down there. So I think it's an important subject to explore further. But getting
back to your other points about business objectives and boundaries, organizations launch initiatives to solve some kind of a business problem or to exploit some kind of a business opportunity. You do it for some reason.
Yeah.
And with the idea behind this really important point of defining your business objectives is to make sure we know what we're trying to accomplish by even working on this project. How is the world going to be better in some way with this solution in it than it is today? Right. And you can have business objectives that are financial or non-financial. You can have them be strategic or tactical. They can be inward facing, like process oriented, or they can be outward facing, like products. It doesn't matter, but in each case, what we want to do is understand, what are we trying to accomplish with this solution that you're discussing, and how can we quantify that? How can we measure that? It's really easy to be vague with business objectives. We want to be, world class and the industry leader or whatever. But it's much better to try to come up with measurable targets, because then you can track whether you're making progress toward that. You can make sure that the work we do is aligned toward achieving those outcomes. And that helps keep everybody focused towards these common objectives. And it also helps with scope definition when you're doing like release planning, so you understand what parts of the solution are addressing those targets.
Yeah, and that's such an important point because it lines up perfectly with the experiences that I've had in all of the solutions that I've developed. And to some analysts, I think going through the practice of defining business objectives can seem a little pointless because it seems like it's a little bit, I don't think they see the real connection of defining business objectives to the product that they're looking to deliver. It just seems a little bit distant. In my experience, defining the business objectives up front and, very importantly, getting stakeholder agreement on what those objectives are it really kind of acts as an umbrella under which we're building the product.
Exactly.
And it goes to the point, I think, that you made about the next principle, which is defining the boundaries, right? If you have clear business objectives, it becomes very easy for you as an analyst to disqualify a requirement that doesn't fit within those business objectives. And I think the art of knowing how to disqualify a stakeholder ask as a requirement is a key skill that an analyst needs to learn. And to do it elegantly, I think you need clear business objectives so you can figure out, which I think is the next principle of defining the solution's boundaries.
Yeah, in fact, there's a phrase that I use around this. We talk a lot about scope on software projects, but I like to talk about limitations as well. And that's what you were kind of getting at by saying, okay, what are we not going to do? So I'm an organic chemist by background. I have a PhD in organic chemistry, which personally I've always thought was the perfect background for anyone in IT, although that seems to be a minority viewpoint. But whenever an organic chemist invents some new kind of reaction, they write a paper about it that says, here's what the reaction does and doesn't do, because they have a section called scope and limitations. Well, we need not just scope, we need to describe limitations as well to help us understand these boundaries between what's in and what's out, because that's what scope's all about. And I saw this done very well once at one of my consulting clients. I was a foreign country that was developing a website for one of their national sports teams. It was actually their rugby team. And they had a list of, features and stuff for their website to support this team. But they had also made a list that said, here are some things people might expect they'd be able to do at this website, but we're not going to do that, at least not now. So they had a list of exclusions or limitations. And I think that's a really important point. So we need to define those ins and outs. And I had a really good example. Here we're talking so far about things that are out, but sometimes things are in that you are surprised at. I was at another client once, and a woman in the class I was teaching showed me a context diagram that she had drawn for the system she was working on, to the best of her understanding. And the context diagram is a very simple but useful analysis model. There's a circle with the name of your system in it. Yeah. You don't know anything about the details of the system. And then you've got these boxes outside of it called external entities, which have flows or arrows connecting them to the circle. So at least at a top level, what's the environment of things that connect to your system and what are the nature of those interfaces. Very, very high level. That's so right. My client told me she had shown her context diagram to the project sponsor, who looked at he pointed at one of the external entities, one of those boxes outside the circle, and said, oh, this one system that you've shown on the outside of your system is actually going to be a part of this project. In other words, it just moved inside the circle. Yeah. So what just happened to the scope of her project as she understood it? It got bigger, right?
Much bigger. And I mean, the importance of doing a context diagram, I think the way I describe it is that when it comes to project scope, when it comes to the size and cost of software development, there are a few things that are more expensive to build than system interfaces. And I've been on more than one project where the context diagram has revealed to our stakeholders and our project sponsors about the true cost of what this solution is going to look like. And I think that when it comes to drawing boundaries, the system context diagram is perhaps one of the most effective tools. I produce one on every single business case that I do. Good for you. Because as part of the business case, I have to make sure that I have a relatively accurate view of the costs. And oftentimes building system interfaces are way more complex than a lot of people assume, because there's a lot of logic that goes in, and software is quite finicky when it's trying to exchange data. So
Yeah, you get things like, just a little bit of field length difference in a piece of data and you're screwed,
it is, or what to do if you don't receive the results that you were expecting, right? Because both, I mean, we can get into a conversation around system interfaces, but I think your point around making sure that the system context diagram is done well, I think is a critical point. Now, for most junior business analysts, I don't think that they would ever be in a position where they could have those conversations. But as you start to become more and more senior in your career, and you're given the responsibility to figure out what the true cost of a product is, that's when you start to have to adopt things like system context diagrams. And even though you mentioned that it's a simple diagram, even though it's a very simple diagram, I find that it requires a lot of knowledge about
It does.
the application landscape to get correct.
Mm-hmm.
Has that been your experience?
Well, sure, because you're not just looking at your system in isolation, you're looking at it in context.
That's right.
That's the name of it. It's the context diagram. So you're showing how it connects to things and what those things are. And those things outside your system could be different user classes. They could be other software applications or systems or databases. They could be hardware devices, anything that you have to connect to and interface with. And I'm glad you made the point about the complexity and cost associated with interfaces. My last book before this one was called Software Development Pearls. And it's got 60 lessons I've learned over my career about software development in categories like requirements and design and project management and culture and teamwork and others. And one of my points around design is that a lot of the problems take place at system interfaces. So you have to understand those so that you can see where it fits in. But it gets worse than that, actually. So you got your context diagram in its immediate environment, but very often there are some connections that are farther removed, so that your system connects to this other application, which then gets services over there and then validates payment over here with all these other interfaces. So there's another kind of picture you can draw called an ecosystem map. And an ecosystem map takes one step farther back so that you can look at that more extended environment. And again, at a high level, see the connections. And you talked in terms of how much information you need to do that. Well, you probably need to know who's responsible for those other systems. Where do I get the information about those interfaces, whether it's an API or a user interface that passes through somehow. So there is a lot of knowledge you have to have. And what you don't want to do is end up in a situation where you're working locally and then you find that something out here changed and we didn't know it was important and we didn't hear about it and now our system's broken. That's a bad thing.
That's right. And to many of the folks that may be listening to this who are just getting into the profession, I think they're left with the impression that, again, let's just go back to the beginning where we talked about what it takes to be an analyst, right? Some analysts think that they can write a user story and do a mock-up, and that's their job. And for some junior analysts who are just starting out their careers, it is. We just kind of drifted into a conversation around, we went from there and we drifted into a conversation around what the true work of a senior analyst can look like, because enterprise environments are so complex. I mean, some of the projects that I've worked on have taken me, the ecosystem diagram that you're talking about, I did as part of a business case that I was helping one of my clients establish. Hundreds of applications, hundreds of point-to-point interfaces without really a common architecture. That's an incredibly complex world to try to do business and systems analysis within, because there are so many moving pieces. I'm going to park that because I think that's a very senior level conversation. We'll park that for now. And maybe I'll ask you one more question around maybe some best practices for, let's say, an intermediate level analyst who's who's not given the responsibility to do the level of work we just talked about, but let's say they're implementing some new features on an existing system. Can you offer us any best practices on how to establish a boundary on a piece of software? Is there anything you can offer us on that front?
Well, I don't think the analyst that you're talking about would be establishing that boundary. They'd certainly have to know what the boundaries are, though, so they can make those decisions about, okay, here's a change request. Is it even in scope for what we're supposed to do?
Right.
Furthermore, if there are boundaries between components and systems in your world, which one does it belong in? If you say, yeah, that's something we need to accommodate, but where does it fit? So that's an architectural partitioning issue, to allocate that to one or more of the components that you have. So this is why it's so important for the analysts to understand enough about the architecture and those interfaces and boundaries to be able to make those kinds of decisions. In fact, people in general, I think one of the practices they have to keep in mind is our practice number 5, which is to identify empowered decision makers. Because the business analyst who's confronted maybe with a change request, right, number 5 there, the BA may not be in a position to make the decision about, do we accept this change request? If so, what do I do with it? But someone has to make those decisions. So in identifying the many kinds of requirements related decisions that you encounter on a project and making sure in your project or your product, who are the people that are going to make those decisions and how will each of those groups make their decision? That is, what decision rule will they follow? Those are all important things, and your BA may just be a victim of that process, but they need to know how that is all done.
I think you get it. I think you get into a very interesting place in the conversation because the way I look at it is I'm kind of geared towards helping analysts become high performers. And there are certain characteristics that I expect out of a high performer and that my clients expect out of a high performer that an average business analyst may not be willing to take on. And I think that this area of establishing boundaries is one of those areas where, as an analyst, you may be a victim, right? Because you're not actively lobbying for a line to be drawn in a specific area. Now, I've been in consulting for at least the last decade or so, and the expectation from my clients on what I should be doing is quite a bit higher. And so oftentimes I find myself in a position where, based on my previous experience, I have to push things in a certain direction. And so I'm actively lobbying for certain things to be completely cut out of this solution because I don't think it's a good fit. I don't think the value is there. And although I am the analyst, I'm not the decision maker. I've become a bit of a lobbyist. And I think there's a skill that analysts can focus on, which is centered around facilitating decisions, right?
Right.
You're not a decision maker, but you probably also don't want to become a victim of decisions either, the way you mentioned. And the best way to do that is to become an active participant and facilitate decisions. You have to make sure that your customers understand what they need to know to make the right decision. And I do take that on as part of my own practice. I can't believe that the time has flown as quickly as it has, because I don't think I'm even close to getting down to the list of questions I wanted to ask. I do want to leave a little bit of time for some of the comments, so we'll shift over it and maybe let's see if we have any questions that we can address. And folks, we are live right now. If you do have a question, put it directly in the comments. We have a comment from here. It doesn't show us who the LinkedIn user is. It says measure twice, cut once. I watched a YouTube video last night of an entire house being built from foundation. The contractor said that. LOL. Okay, well we have somebody who's heard that in real life here.
Well, I can top that. I have a friend once who suffered that in real life. He had a house built, custom house built. And when they moved in, one of the things he found out is that there was a closet in one of the bedrooms, and he put a hanger on the rod in the closet and he couldn't close the closet door.
Right.
And that was strange. The closet was too shallow. And upon investigation, what they found was that dimension of the house had been built 1 foot too short. And so the closets on that wall were useless. Now that's clearly a measure versus cutting, or at least measure once, dig the hole, or measure twice, dig the hole once or something. And by the time that wall is built, it's pretty expensive to then fix that problem and push the house down 1 foot bigger. So he was just stuck with it. So yeah, he's sensitive to that.
That's right. And, and that closet example is a perfect analogy. Did you understand what the person's putting in that closet? Did you understand the business need?
Yep.
Did you understand the actual requirements and the specification? And very importantly, did that message carry through to the people who are actually looking to build this, right? As an
Apparently
analyst,
not.
yeah, you have to be cognizant of all of these things because software
Yeah.
development and building construction have so many parallels, so many parallels. We have a comment here from Falguni Patel who says, I've heard and used this expression before. And just quickly scrolling through to see if we have any questions. How does, we have a question over here. How does this fit with governance of a project?
Well, first of all, in that question, I don't know what this is referring to. And second, I'm not exactly sure what kind of governance they're talking about. If we're talking about governance being the overall management of the whole thing, then, well, yeah, somebody's responsible for making sure that we have in place processes and communication mechanisms and ownership and responsibilities and authorities and all of that to make sure that the right people make the right decisions based on the right kinds of information supplied by people like the BA that you were describing a little earlier.
Right.
So yeah, somebody's got to own the problem. And so I would say basically all of this fits in with governance of the project.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think that's a very difficult question to answer for a couple of the reasons, but governance really is about just making sure that the organization has the controls in place to mitigate risks.
Mm-hmm.
They oftentimes don't get down to the level of detail where they take an active participation in defining boundaries or an active participation in making sure that you've gotten all the interfaces identified on your context diagram. So they don't come down to that.
They should then at least see that all those roles are in place, that the authority is clear, that the responsibility is clear, that the communication mechanisms are established, and that somebody is verifying that everything is done correctly. I would say that fits in governance, even if they're not involved with the nuts and bolts on a daily basis.
That's right. And I think that is the answer to that question, Karl. I think that making sure that the controls and the rules are in place to make sure that these risks are all mitigated. That's a great question. I'm just looking through to see if we have any other questions. We have quite a few comments here. Enterprise projects are extremely complex for sure. I'm sorry for whoever the LinkedIn user is. It does not tell me, it doesn't show your profile. But we have some folks that are coming in here. Brad says, governance organizations would benefit from a document project lifecycle that details the required artifacts and what roles and responsible for producing and consuming.
Yes, excellent definition. Thanks, Brad, for sharing that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you'll see that as you get into larger and larger organizations, that a lot of these types of governance structures do exist. For many folks who are starting off their careers in smaller companies, they tend to not have the need or the will to put together this level of governance. But when you get into enterprise, it's nearly impossible for the organization to function well without the proper governance structures. And so we have a very good definition from Brad on what governance is. We are at 12:45, and I do want to be respectful. We do have a lot of other comments that have come in. I don't see any other questions that we can answer. Can you give us an idea, Karl, I would say about, can you give folks an idea of where is the best place for them to connect with you if they want to find out more?
Sure. If you're interested in connecting with me, my company is Process Impact, and my website for my company is processimpact.com.
Yeah.
My personal website is karlwiegers.com, and I have there a number of things that might be interesting or amusing. And incidentally, one of the things I have at the processimpact.com site are links to dozens and dozens of articles on many topics that I've posted on my medium.com account. Those might be interesting. And then if you're interested in learning more about this book, Software Requirements Essentials, the website for that is SoftwareRex, that's softwarereqs.com, and that's the page right there where you can learn more about that. And one of the things you can do at that page is to access about a dozen or more, I think 15 or 16 maybe, downloads
Yeah.
We've got a bunch of checklists. I'm a big fan of checklists. And so we've got a lot of checklists for various things like identifying stakeholders and characterizing stakeholders and questions to ask to help you define business requirements, those kinds of things. There's some spreadsheet tools there. And one of the things that would be helpful, we talked a little bit about business objectives, and there's a paper accessible from that list of downloads about the business objectives model, which is a very helpful diagram for helping you think through what's our problem, what is our objective, how could we measure that. So there's a very concise little paper there that can help you see how to draw these useful diagrams.
Well, I do plan on spending a lot more time on this website to go through much of this material. I think that just looking at this, you see that you have a number of templates that a lot of folks are kind of compelled to pay money for. And it seems like you're providing a lot of this material completely for free. Folks who are interested in getting a use case template can find that here. So this one's new. I have seen your website process impact, I think probably all throughout my career.
It's been up there since 1997.
Yeah, I've seen this website. I've seen many times all throughout my career. And so it's a bit of an honor for me to have you actually appear on the show and share a lot of your knowledge with us. Thank you for taking the time, Karl.
My pleasure.
Okay. Thank you, everybody else. I want to let folks know that anytime, if you need access to these links, you can very quickly and easily get access to them just by going to bablocks.com/live. And there you're going to find Karl's link to the software Rex. That is the website that we were just looking at, where we talked, where we saw many of the templates that Karl is sharing with folks completely for free. I'm definitely going to be looking at this business objectives model document in a little bit more detail, but that's where you can find all of the links. I will also make sure that our live page contains the link to the Process Impact website so that you can find all of these links at bablocks.com/live. Also, you'll find the links to all of the previous live sessions that we've had. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and we'll hopefully see you on the next one.